Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Today, we make our free agency predictions, landing spots for Ohtani, Cody Bellinger, Blake Snell, and many more. We also talk about the Mets front office hires, the Yamamoto sweepstakes, and of course, we answer your mailbag questions. So subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today, and here's your reminder to subscribe to our show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And Joe, it is that time of year, not just with the Mets, but all across baseball. A ton of moves happening, whether it's front office moves, coaching staffs, free agency, and trade rumors and signings across the league. Nothing too significant for the Mets yet, but there's a lot going on in baseball right now. And since we last recorded, two notable moves for the Mets in hiring Kris to be their VP of scouting, somebody that comes with a big-time resume from the Astros, and Andy Green, who was the Cubs bench coach. The Cubs wanted to keep him in the organization, a couple various roles that were on the table for him. He ends up leaving the organization as well and comes to the Mets to run player development. So two pretty significant hires, Joe, for the Mets, and most notably for David Stearns.
Definitely two significant hires. First, we'll start with Kris coming over as the VP of amateur scouting. He spent the last 11 years with the Astros, with the last 5 of those being as the scouting director. And he comes over, and the way the Mets had things positioned was pretty uncommon in the game. There's not many teams that have it this way, where there was one head over both domestic and international scouting. Those are really two full-time jobs itself. So putting it all on one person is probably not the most efficient way to do things. Bringing in someone with the qualities of Kris and being able to separate domestic and international, I think, is huge for the Mets. And talking to people throughout the league about what Kris is all about, they say he's an incredibly bright scouting mind. He comes from an old school scouting mindset, but he's obviously embraced the analytical mindset that the Astros are at the forefront of, and combining that in the scouting world makes him a perfect fit for the Mets organization right now for a big 2024 draft that here in the next couple of weeks, as the winter meetings approach, we're going to be hoping that the draft lottery balls are in the Mets' favor. And, you know, maybe he's picking number 1 overall, but hopefully, certainly he's picking top 6. And that way the first pick doesn't drop 10 spots.
Yeah, so significant moves for the Mets here. You know, obviously getting a new face to run player development, I'm sure, was also at the top for Stearns here. And with not just the external hires, right? Because those are hires they went outside, especially Gross, which was I'm sure in the industry was pretty shocking to a lot of people, just when you look at how long he was with the Astros and the amount of success he had for a organization that has drafted well while he's been there. They also bring Eric Chavez back to being a hitting coach. Eric Chavez and Jeremy Barnes, co-hitting coaches. Chavez was Buck's bench coach last year. We know from a couple of years ago, Chavez had rave reviews as the Mets hitting coach. It seemed like there was, I don't know, I wouldn't say disappointment last year, but more so that was a role where we heard a lot of praise for Chavez, and I'm sure it sounds like a lot of players will be happy to see him return to that role for this team.
I find it very interesting that the Mets, they've kept a lot of their coaching staff intact, maybe more so than I thought. I think going in, I was like, Jeremy Hefner is safe. Anyone else is susceptible to be gone. But Eric Chavez moving back into the hitting coach role, moving back to what worked in 2022, which was Eric Chavez as the hitting coach and Jeremy Barnes as the assistant hitting coach. But I guess they might be calling him co-hitting coach now. Whatever, it's like the assistant to the regional manager thing from The Office. I don't know. But I think it's a good move. Players are comfortable with Chavez. They like him a lot. And clearly the offense worked pretty well in 2022. But then if you even go beyond that, It sounds like Glenn Sherlock might be coming back as a catching instructor, which is huge for Francisco Alvarez, as he made massive strides defensively behind the plate. Because you and I were talking on this show a year ago, will Francisco Alvarez be able to be a major league catcher defensively? And he was one of the better pitch framers in all of baseball. So that's a huge credit to Glenn Sherlock. And they're even bringing back Danny Barnes. So there's two Barnes on the staff, but Danny Barnes is, and they're calling him an information coach, which I think is kind of like a quality control analyst type of role in the dugout. But quite a few holdovers, which was relatively surprising. But I think what that tells you is the front office and the organization says, we think we have really good coaches, and we think 2023 was just a really weird year where players underperformed and there were injuries, and they didn't want to put it all on the coaching staff and risk losing individuals that they believe bring great value. So we'll see how they've plugged the bench coach job. I know Phil Nevin's name is getting thrown around a bit, and they still have to fill first and third base as Wayne Kirby's contract expired and Joey Cora left the organization. So they still have a couple more things to do, but they're very close to being at a point where David Stearns and his front office can fully focus on building the 2024 Mets roster. As you mentioned, Andy Green in player development is a big hire. Kris Gross, obviously, in scouting. So he's kind of built this thing up to now it's about time to start worrying about players.
And I think, for those that are looking around and going, wow, not a lot of turnover necessarily from the staff as a whole. Buck was a big change, but This is a team that not that long ago, Joe, won over 100 games. And the belief in these guys has always been pretty, it's been amplified, I would say. We've heard really good things about Hefner for a long time. We've heard plenty of good things about Chavez, who we've gotten to speak to on this show before. So it felt like they needed a fresh start at manager, and Stearns wanted to work with somebody that, it was his hire, somebody that he's comfortable with, somebody that he sees eye to eye with. But the Mets have had a good coaching staff. So to see some of these names return, especially Chavez in a role he's very comfortable with, I think is promising. And like you said, with all of that news behind us, you could start to turn the page to the most notable transactions of the offseason, which is the actual players. And before we get to the guys that have already played in Major League Baseball, we have to start with Yoshinobu Yamamoto, of course, because the sweepstakes has officially begun. It feels like everybody that has some money and wants to win is going to be in. There might even be some teams in, Joe, that typically aren't looked at as a win now team, because this guy is 25. He could be part of your win now plans for the next 8 years if you see a win now year in an 8-year window somewhere. So this is going to be crazy. We talked about it last show. I remember you saying like, hey, this is going to be a guy that his market probably starts at 200 million. Do we think it climbs to 300? No, we're not getting that crazy, but there's going to be a lot of teams need pitching. A lot of teams want young pitching and want to have a rotation put together for the long term with a piece like this that you think can be an answer for at least the next half decade. So here we go. Buckle up.
So just for clarity, he was officially posted on Monday. Bidding was able to start here Tuesday, November 21st at 8 a.m. Eastern time. And he has until January 4th of 2024 at 5 p.m. Eastern to sign. I can't imagine it's going to take nearly that long, but
for our sanity, let's hope it doesn't.
Please not. I mean, we can't do this for another month and a half. But what I will say is the Yoshinobu Yamamoto market is going to be very interesting to follow, because when you look at just the sheer dollars, like we talk about it like it's nothing. We're like, yeah, it's going to start at 200 million. No problem. If Yoshinobu Yamamoto signs for $200 million, he will have the third highest total contract for a pitcher currently in the major leagues. And one of those two is Steven Strasburg, who's done for his career. He's not pitching anymore. So technically he'd be number 2, and it could go further than 200 million. So that is how high the industry is on Yoshinobu Yamamoto. It's obviously a massive risk in that sense when you just take it from a sheer dollar standpoint. Teams are basically saying, we think Yoshinobu Yamamoto is already a top 5 pitcher in the sport, basically. and he has never thrown a baseball on a U.S. mound before. With that said, I expect the Mets to be one of a few teams that are heavily involved. And I think there's going to be some teams that maybe we don't expect, because most of the time when you hear a $200 million player, you're just like, Mets, Dodgers, Yankees,
right,
Red Sox, whatever. They're the select few big market teams. But there's word of teams like the Diamondbacks potentially being interested, word of teams like the Tigers being interested, because even teams that are not necessarily all in right now, they can justify an 8-year type of deal, and it might go to 8. Who knows? It could go to 9, and it's going to be very... I'm fascinated to see how major league teams handle Yoshinobu Yamamoto, because he could be certainly one of the biggest pitcher contracts that we've ever seen, and he's never been here before. So I can't wait to see how it goes over the next coming weeks. And SNY's Andy Martino reported that he intends to meet with teams in early December. He doesn't see necessarily the need to go on tours and see stadiums. Like, you remember Kodai Senga last year. He took a U.S. tour, got probably some nice dinners, got to check out ballparks and facilities before signing with the Mets. Yamamoto, it doesn't sound like that's something he's requiring. So maybe it's a thing where Yamamoto is going to post up in the L.A. area where his agency is, and teams are going to come to him to pitch. So anytime now, that's the fun part of it. He could sign right this very second, or anytime between now and January 4th. So we'll be following that very intently here, as Yoshinobu Yamamoto has Mets top target written all over him.
Yeah, it feels like a safe play. This is going to be, and once again, as you said, Andy reported he'll meet with teams early in December. Like, this is going to be after Thanksgiving, but probably before Christmas. It would be a little surprising if this dragged out past that. Joe, I want to ask you this, because we talk about Yamamoto every week, literally since July, I think. And I want this to be a different conversation. Do you think some teams that have made moves might now be clearly out of it? We saw the Phillies bring back Aaron Nola on a mammoth deal in terms of term. We saw the Cardinals sign 2 guys to, 1-year deals, but they weren't 1 year, $2 million, or you get a major league camp invite. I mean, with Lance Lynn and Kyle Gibson, they got money and they got spots in the rotation. Do you think this is at least starting to narrow a little bit when you see moves like that, or really it's one of those anything can happen?
I like to say anything could happen, but I find it hard to imagine the Phillies will be... I know there's a report that they're going to be in on Yamamoto, and you can never put anything past them, but it sounds like their priorities are going to be locking up Zach Wheeler, who's a free agent again, I believe, after this season.
Yeah, it's on his last year.
Yeah, so Zach is coming up, and I think they want to keep him. There's also been word that they might redo Bryce Harper's deal to give him more money, which I guess
very odd in baseball.
Yeah, very odd, but sounds like that's on the table. So I don't know if they're going to have the stomach for another $200+ million pitcher.
And Hoskins is out there, which,
I think he's
over.
Gone. Yeah, I think that's over.
Castellanos being there, they have a lot of money in that lineup. They bought. It worked. Don't get me wrong, to an extent. They bought that lineup.
And they said Bryce Harper's a first baseman full-time going forward, so he's done in the outfield. And Schwarber's basically a DH that they jam and left. So I think Hoskins is leaving there. When you look at St. Louis, I know that Yoshinobu Yamamoto is good friends with Lars Nootbaar. He was golfing with him on Instagram the other day. But I wonder, do the Cardinals have the financial stomach for, like you said, they signed Lance Lynn and Kyle Gibson for $23 million combined in 2024 payroll. So that's certainly not an insignificant addition. Do they have another $30 million plus for Yamamoto? I don't know. But certainly it's going to be a hot and heavy market, and the Mets have cleared up, their 40-man roster where they have room to add him in depth. They certainly have payroll flexibility once you get beyond 2024, and the Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander stuff starts to fall off the books. So I still think the Mets have a really, really good shot here, but these other teams sent their GMs over to Japan too, and I don't think they're funding those kind of flights to not take a serious stab at them when you think about the Giants, the Yankees, and teams like that.
And what this will be a showdown between the Mets and the Yankees that we haven't seen yet in the Steve Cohen era. And it's exciting for the city. It'll be, and it doesn't mean Yamamoto is going to the Mets or the Yankees, but they are clearly, they're up there in terms of the favorites, you would think at this point. So this is going to be a really, really fascinating free agency chase. And, you mentioned there the Mets have roster spots open. They non-tendered Luis Guillorme. They non-tendered Daniel Vogelback and a couple relievers along that line. Like this roster, Yamamoto or not, this roster is going to look a lot different next year. Of course, on the front end, we think Pete Alonso is going to be here. We know Francisco Lindor is going to be here, and Senga and Diaz and Nimmo. But there'll still be fingerprints in terms of the depth of this roster from Stearns right away with those non-tenders.
Yeah, right now their 40-man roster stands at 28.
Yeah.
And that also has a couple guys on the bottom end of it that if they wanted to get more than 12 players on the 40-man roster, there's a couple guys they could probably sneak through waivers. But yeah, they're set up to remake this 40-man roster. And I think one of the things that Will Salmon told us about David Stearns, and certainly anything you've read about him, is David Stearns values every single 40-man roster spot. And I think there were times here with the Mets that it was a bit of a top-heavy roster where if everything was right, everyone was healthy, the Mets had a good team. But once they had to dive into their 40-man roster depth, that's when things would fall apart. And I think David Stearns is going to make it a priority that is less of an issue. Maybe can't turn it over overnight to a big time 40-man roster, but I think as we move ahead for this year, next year, and the year after, you're going to see the Mets 40-man roster, I think, be much deeper, where when injuries inevitably happen, you're calling upon someone that you actually believe could give you an opportunity if they're starting on the mound that day, or if someone has to fill in at second base or whatever the position may be. I think David Stearns is going to focus on making the Mets as deep as possible, and he's opened that flexibility right now.
So let's get into our free agency predictions. We got all the big names on this list, of course, here. And Joe, this will be simple. It can be, hey, we've heard a lot of rumors about this one, or it could be like, I like this fit. And we have to start with Shohei Ohtani, of course, because I'll say this, and call me crazy if you think I'm off base here. I feel like this has lost a lot of life. I thought this free agency, and it's because he got hurt, of course. If he was an ace pitcher and one of the best power hitters in the game on the open market, it feels like, LeBron's first free agency only now in baseball. So maybe it is because of the injury, but I think part of it, Joe, and tying my prediction into this, is anything besides the Dodgers would come as a surprise to me. And I know there's some drawn up interest out there. The Mariners, the Cubs, I guess the Giants. The Giants are one that makes sense to me after what we saw them try to do last year and they couldn't. But man, Joe, I don't know at this point how you pick anyone but the Dodgers in this spot.
I think the reason it's lost life is because supposedly Shohei Ohtani is meeting with teams in private, and him and his agent are supposedly telling teams, if word gets out that this meeting happened, you're out.
Wow.
So
yeah.
Shohei is an under the radar guy. He
does not like the parade of any of this.
No, he doesn't want the fun part of free agency, which is everybody talking about you all the time. He just wants meet with the team, figure out where he wants to play for the next 10 years, who he wants to give him $500 million or whatever the case may be. So I think that's probably a big part of it, is often the insiders, the Andy Martinos, the Jeff Passons, the John Heymans, anyone you can name, Ken Rosenthal's, they get little things from the agency. They get little things from teams, and, it keeps the rumor season alive. Well, Shohei Ohtani and his agent want none of that. And I imagine if they're meeting with teams with this kind of edict, they're probably meeting with the owner and the GM, and that's it. And no one else is allowed to know this is happening. So like you said, Dodgers probably the favorite, but I don't like going chalk. That's no fun. I think the Cubs end up with Shohei Ohtani. I think when you give a manager like Craig Counsell the biggest managerial contract in history, you don't do that to just have an okay offseason or build for 2026. You have it to make a massive impact right out the gates. I think Shohei Ohtani can own the city of Chicago, almost literally with the money he's going to get, but he could basically own the city of Chicago as a Cub. So I'm going to say Ohtani does not do what most people expect, and he ends up with the Cubs.
I'll go for my non-Dodgers pick. I'll go with the Giants, and it just
they've been begging someone to take their money,
right?
Someone please take our money, and everyone says no.
And it fits the narrative of like, hey, if he really wants to stay out west, but it's not the Dodgers, and we know that rivalry, the Giants might feel like, man, we need a splash, and this is one where we get the double win here. If we get Ohtani. And we also make sure the Dodgers don't get Ohtani. But you're right. It's a big part of that is his lack of desire of making this free agency interesting. And that's his right. All guys that get to this point and have played well enough and carried themselves well enough to be that in demand, you can choose how you want to handle your own free agency. And that's the route Ohtani has gone. And also, this goes back to our theme of, when players of this caliber, like Aaron Judge last year, right? When players of that caliber hit free agency, there's not an overwhelming amount of teams that can even get a meeting. You know what I'm saying? Like if the Rockies call Ohtani's agent, he's probably going to be like, are you guys actually like wanting to meet with us? Or you just, you want a story out there that you're trying. So
that's when you answer the phone. You go, I'm going through a tunnel. Sorry.
Yeah. Losing you.
Yeah.
So this is where it gets more interesting, right? How about Cody Bellinger? Speaking of the Cubs, because I look at Cody Bellinger and go, man, the Cubs can go a lot of different ways. Like, what if they go out and get Yamamoto, or what if they go out and get Ohtani? It feels like the Cubs, not only because they hired Counsell, but the Cubs are looking to be splashy this offseason. But me thinking that they might come up a little short for both Ohtani and a little short for Ohtani. I don't see them as a top 3 team in for Yamamoto. It feels like Bellinger's most likely route is back with the Cubs after having so much success there in a bounce back season on a 1-year deal. Joe, do you see kind of a market out there, though, that's a little bit more exciting or different?
I think there's a couple teams that we could look at for Bellinger. I think the Cubs certainly are in play. Yankees are in play, but for me, I went with the Giants. Someone's going to take the money from the Giants, and Cody Bellinger has a connection to Farhan Zaidi from their days when Farhan was with the Dodgers, and now he's the head of the Giants baseball ops. So I'll say Cody Bellinger to the Giants.
How about we'll do these 2 pitchers together, Blake Snell and Marcus Stroman. I'll think for Snell's a tough one because of the draft pick attached and his odd innings limits at times here, Joe, or not limits, but not getting deep through games and Stroman has a crazy injury history. These two, while showing incredible runs of talent at times, come with like Carlos Rodon level risk in my eyes.
There's definitely risk with both of them. I think a little more from an injury standpoint with Blake Snell historically, but for me, I went right back to the Giants with Blake Snell. I think he's going to stay West Coast. So I went Giants, but keep an eye on the Seattle Mariners for Blake Snell. Washington area guy would have interest in going back there, and the Mariners could sign Snell and then flip some of their young pitching for offensive upgrades. And Marcus Stroman, I don't know why, feels like the Dodgers need multiple starters, and I feel like I could see Marcus Stroman shipping out to LA and enjoying himself out there as a Dodger.
Yeah, that wouldn't shock me. I believe he's posted, I don't know if he still lives out there. I know he's obviously that location might interest him. I'll go with the Diamondbacks for Stroman. I think if they need to get a pitcher, but they kind of take that big swing at the top and can't get one of the top dogs, maybe they get a guy like Stroman to solidify their rotation a little bit. How about Matt Chapman here, Joe? A guy with a gold glove and a big power bat, but definitely some holes in that swing at times.
Platinum glove winner too,
right?
More than once. So fantastic defensive third baseman, big time power. If you could find a way to make him make more contact consistently, then he certainly is a very intriguing option. I'm going right to the Arizona Diamondbacks that you mentioned. Evan Longoria played a good role as a veteran third baseman for them. He's a free agent, and I think Arizona will look to supplement their young core with a potential impact middle of the order bat like Matt Chapman.
All right, Jordan Montgomery, one of my favorite free agents. I was really hoping that he would be a Met, and then he went out and had 2 months of championship caliber pitching. That if the Mets go after Yamamoto, it'd be hard to imagine that. I'll go with the Red Sox for Montgomery. What do you think of that, Joe?
That's exactly what I did too. So I think it makes sense. Red Sox really need starting pitching, and they need someone to pitch in the upper portion of the rotation around Chris Sale, and having the reliability of someone like Jordan Montgomery, I think, would be very enticing to Boston.
Our next one, Rhys Hoskins. We talked about how he might be 1 foot out the door there with Philly with all the money they've spent and where they're looking to spend going forward. Power, a guy that can get on base, Joe. More fascinating than the actual team he goes to, but I do want to ask you that is, what does this deal look like? Is Rhys Hoskins taking a 1-year Cody Bellinger type deal and wants to bounce back and then get a 3 to 4 year deal after? Or do you think he just takes the deal with the longest term after that injury?
I think it's 1 year or 2 years with an opt-out, which is a pretty common.
I like the Mets then.
The Mets are certainly an interesting candidate for a Hoskins. I'd be interested in him. I wonder if he wants to play first base versus DH.
That's a good point.
And if he wants to play first base, there's a team that supposedly wants Pete Alonso. The Cubs have an opening at first base.
Yeah, so Christopher Morel is the highlight of the trade package.
I have the Cubs with Rhys Hoskins and Shohei Ohtani, adding about 70 home runs to the middle of that Chicago order for Craig Counsell. Should be pretty enticing.
So let's kind of do the DH roundabout here then, coming off of Hoskins. Jorge Soler, JD Martinez, Justin Turner. I could see, we've talked about Soler liking his fit with the Mets, the same reason as Hoskins. With JD Martinez, Joe, it seems like either a return to 2 places he's played the last 2 years makes sense. Either Boston or the Dodgers for me, for JD. Assuming Justin Turner moves on from Boston, who's also a name we have here.
I have JD Martinez going back to the Dodgers because I think the Dodgers probably have said to him, hey, if we don't get Ohtani, we have this contract here waiting for you, so you could just stay here and make good money. So I have Ohtani to the Cubs. Thus, I'm going to have JD Martinez to back to the Dodgers. I'm giving Justin Turner to the Texas Rangers.
I like that fit.
I think they want to do some work at DH, and he could spell a little third base on occasion, maybe some first base on occasion. And yes, you're listening to the Mets pod, so I'm going to say the Mets are going to sign somebody on this list, and I think Jorge Soler fits really, really well with the Mets. He could play the outfield in a pinch, but he is transitioning into a true designated hitter, and everything about his numbers and his metrics suggest he should be a very impactful one. That could be a 30-plus home run guy, which is everything Mets fans have been hoping for in a designated hitter. And I will go Jorge Soler to the Mets, Justin Turner to the Rangers, and JD Martinez to the Dodgers for our DH triumvirate.
So our last free agent before a fun trade candidate, Josh Hader. Joe, before the Braves went out and got like 6 relievers in the first 4 days of free agency or whatever it was, and I know they're not all going to be in the bullpen. Hader would have made sense for me a little bit with Atlanta, but they're going more of the volume route. They are spending significant money, but Hader's going to be a big-time spend candidate here. Once again, the Diamondbacks intrigued me when we saw what that bullpen dealt with before. I also think the Mariners are really interesting in this spot as well. I wish the Orioles, doing this exercise makes me, you hear Joe and I say about the same 8 teams typically, and even the Yankees are interesting too. The Yankees are obviously in on Yamamoto. I wish the other teams did all get in on this, though, because you look at the Orioles injury situation with Felix, they're a win now team. They need a Josh Hader as well. We just know they're never going to spend that kind of money on a reliever. Yeah,
he's trying to get Edwin Diaz money, and I can't imagine that's a
small market thing. Man. Who's even in on that?
Screams Texas Rangers as bright as humanly possible. Jose Leclerc was a fine closer for them, but you move him into a bit of an 8th inning role and you bring in Josh Hader. I think the Rangers, with the way their roster is built, have to double down, basically, because they have a bunch of older pitching and a lot of money invested. They just need to go all in and try to win as many potential World Series as they can before the wheels inevitably fall off.
So the last name, not a free agent, Juan Soto. I think he gets traded, Joe. You just do the math of the Padres roster and who really can be moved because of term or really because of too much term, I think he gets traded. The question of where, like, everybody looks at the Yankees, and I don't know the prospect package that realistically gets them Soto. When you talk about the Mets, if you have that relationship with Scott Boras and you think Soto is going to get to free agency, why are you giving up top prospects now, which the Mets have? Why are you giving them up now when you can go make a play for him a year from now? And then it's kind of a pool of mystery teams, but a lot of those teams probably are not going to get an extension done with him even if they moved for him now.
Which in a way makes you wonder, are they going to be able to get a good trade for him? Because I don't think they're going to trade him for the sake of trading him. It has to be for a good return. With that said, I think he gets traded. And not only do I think he gets traded, I don't think he goes to free agency. I think
like Juan a Lindor situation.
Yes. I think Juan Soto is traded to the New York Yankees.
Wow.
And before opening day, he signs a mega contract and they build their offense around Aaron Judge, Anthony Volpe, and Juan Soto. And I know that's going to hurt a lot of Met fans that have kind of been waiting for Juan Soto for years, but he just feels like he's made for Yankee Stadium in a way. And I think the Yankees are going to make a splash or two this offseason. And I think Juan Soto fits. They can trade, Michael King and then or Clark Schmidt because Padres want some innings back, and then they have some good prospects at the top of their system, and I don't know, just feels like that one's a fit.
It'll be interesting. We just haven't seen the Yankees operate with that urgency the last couple of years. We really have, and they got to get a Garrett Cole deal done pretty soon again, which is not going to be cheap. Cole's been phenomenal for them. They still have Stanton's money, which is really tough. Judge is on a massive deal. The old Yankees, you'd go, yeah, they're going to add Soto. They're going to add Yamamoto. They're going to
add half of this list. You can
right. And it just feels like now we bring up a name like Soto, who is going to be a $400 million player, Joe, pretty easily.
Yeah, I would think so.
I would think so because of his age. He'll be a 25-year-old free agent. That would be wild. Obviously, me personally, I hope that doesn't happen at all. So with that, you're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your shows. Let's get into the mailbag. Plenty of good mailbag questions this week, and this one from GC who asked, which prospects would you deem untouchable? This is a good transition off the Soto discussion. When making trades this offseason, do you see the Mets being particularly active in the trade market?
I do think they will be active in the trade market. I do not think they will be active at the top of the trade market. I think you should expect, and David Stearns has said this, and it's been a message that this organization, when Billy Epler was here and Steve Cohen even referenced it over the last couple of years, they're going to hug these top prospects pretty tight. So for me, I think they're probably not trading Luis Angel Acuna or Drew Gilbert or Jet Williams. I don't think they even trade someone like Colin Houck, who they drafted last year. I think Ryan Clifford, someone they probably want to hang on to. So I think the list is a little longer than you'd think. But certainly the Mets are going to be very particular with what prospects they move. And I think David Stearns will do his best to be creative on the trade market, which is something he always did in Milwaukee. Whether that is trading Jeff McNeil, I think that's something that is going to be on the table. But maybe him getting a Ford Bronco now and settling that, and now's all good, and McNeil will be back. But I think that's something that has to be under consideration. A guy like Kevin Parada, I think, is, if you want to talk about a top prospect that I'm not saying he's going to get traded, but that feels like a kind of guy that I could see in the right deal, they'd part with him. But I wouldn't expect the Mets to be on the top end of the trade market, moving top prospects to try to go all in on 2024. As we've said, they're building for some success in 2024, but really going for it 25, 26, and down the road.
Yeah, when you look at a Parada, you just wonder if Pete Alonso gets an extension done with the Mets and Alvarez is the catcher of the future, where's Parada playing? And maybe that's not the road that happens. Maybe Parada's just such a high-profile bat that you figure it out. But yeah, I like that call out that out of the guys that are upper echelon prospects, he could be a guy that is on the move if the return was right for a major league piece that has.
And when you look at the trade market, before you get to whatever the next question is, when you look at the trade market, it's a lot of rental type of players.
Always.
Like it's the Tyler Glasnows, it's the Shane Biebers, it's guys that are like that. You really want to be careful in the type of prospects you give up for someone like that. That's a 1-year commitment. Obviously, if they could get a Juan Soto and he wants to sign an extension, that's fantastic. Certainly would be something I think worth considering. But it doesn't look to be, at least on the surface on November 21st, to be a trade market that's flush with multiple years of control options.
Joe, I didn't even get to ask you this at the top of the show, and I don't want to end this episode without asking you this. Brandon Woodruff, a guy that we saw non-tendered, plenty of history with David Stearns. I don't think anybody probably knows him better than David Stearns would. He's expected to miss the season with a shoulder injury. This guy, since 2000, let's call it 18, has been one of the better pitchers in the National League. The reason that I brought this up is you brought up the timeline of the Mets. Hey, they're not going to roll over in 2024, but we know they'll be foot on the gas in 25 and 26. Is there any intrigue from you of getting Woodruff in now? You're going to pay him. You're going to give him a 2 to 3 year deal. We know this year you're paying just for him to rehab with you, but you might have an ace in 2025 and 26.
I am very intrigued at the concept of Brandon Woodruff. Of course, investigate the injury because shoulders are a little different than Tommy John's. Like if you look at what Tyler Glasnow got when he was injured, he signed a 2-year, $30 million deal with an elbow issue. Woodruff coming off the shoulder, I don't think he would get quite as much as Glasnow. I think he'll be below that 2 years, $30 million. But certainly, if all medical reports show that he should make a full recovery for 2025, I think that with the 40-man flexibility that the Mets have, you really just need to carry him on your 40-man until the beginning of spring training. Then you drop him on the 60-day IL and you forget about him for a year. But certainly when you look at that 2025 window, Connor, makes a ton of sense to throw 2 years. I don't want to
26
like 24, 25, 26, something like that. And you spread out the money where it's very little this year and more in 2025, then I think that's something that should be very interesting to the Mets. And to be honest with you, it's probably interesting to about 15 teams. So Brandon Woodruff is going to be able to have his choice of teams where to sign with. But that from the non-tender list, I think he stands out as someone that I would love for the Mets to be aggressive after.
So Kris asked about non-tendered players. Obviously, Woodruff was one. The rest of Chris's question was, would Nick Senzel be one? He seems interesting to me. Non-tendered players usually, there's a reason they were non-tender, but every now and then you get a success story or a comeback story.
Nick Senzel's interesting. He was a very high draft pick, which is probably why people want him and know who he is, but he's played a lot of positions at the big league level. So if you're looking for a bit of a super utility type of guy, Nick Senzel certainly could potentially fill that void, and he's got some pop. Otherwise, it's groups of relievers and things like that. It wasn't the most exciting non-tender list. Like last year, Cody Bellinger was non-tendered, so it's not the most exciting list. But there's always gems, like you said, within the non-tender class that if you can locate the right guy, it could make a significant difference on your team. And I would expect the Mets will look into probably some of the relievers that were non-tendered last week.
This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. And a reminder to subscribe to our show, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel if you want to watch it, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're here all offseason for you. We're going through all the moves, the free agency signings, the trades, the hires, you name it. Joe and I are with you. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.